of the countdown process here. Let's go ahead and step through that. Of course, the countdown will begin with the SpaceX launch director giving the go-ahead for the start of propellant load. SpaceX runs its countdown from the Hangar X site here at the Kennedy Space Center. It's where they refurbish their Falcon boosters and prepare them for future missions, as is the case with the rocket you see there in a live box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll talk more about the booster history of this particular rocket in just a little bit. Once the go-ahead is given for the start of fueling, that process begins at T-minus 35 minutes with the loading of RP-1, or a rocket-grade kerosene, on board the Falcon 9's first and second stages. And at the same time, liquid oxygen starts flowing on board the Falcon 9's first stage. T-minus 30 minutes, they start loading a cryogenic helium onto the pressure vessels of the Falcon 9's first stage. The helium is important because it's used to pressurize the main propellant tanks during flight. Same is true on the second stage a few minutes thereafter. T-minus 23 minutes, loading of second stage RP-1 wraps up. That's followed at T-minus 20 minutes and 50 seconds when the strong back chill down process begins. This is where they are conditioning the feed lines prior to second stage liquid oxygen load. We see it manifest as the so-called big vent. That visually begins about T-minus 20 minutes and 20 seconds. Sets up, again, second stage LOX load, which begins at T-minus 16 minutes. Moving right along, at T-minus 7 minutes is when the engine chill down sequence begins on the Falcon booster. That involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps, helping to protect the engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. About 6 minutes before liftoff, the first stage kerosene tank should be full. Then at T-minus 4.5 minutes, the strong back retract sequence begins. It starts with the clamp arms underneath the payload fairings opening up, and then the transporter erector, the strong back, reclines about 1.5 degrees away from the Falcon 9 rocket. It stays in that position until liftoff, at which point pulls back in a much more rapid fashion to clear the way for the vertical climb of the Falcon 9. About 3 minutes before launch, the first stage LOX tank is full. Same is true on the second stage tank about a minute later. At that point, the Falcon 9 is fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. In the final 60 seconds, as we hear the call, the Falcon 9 is in startup. Control of the countdown is handed over from the ground sequencer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computers. The propellant tanks are brought up to flight pressure. The SpaceX launch director will give their go for launch 45 seconds out. The engine ignition command is issued at T-minus 3 seconds, and if all 9 Merlin 1D engines are healthy and ignite, the command will be given for the hold down clamps to release the Falcon 9 for a T0 liftoff. Again, coming up at 4:28 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 21:28 UTC. Or T-minus 47 minutes and counting. With the launch of the Korea Sat 6A mission earlier today, here's where the bar chart currently stands for SpaceX and its launches of the Falcon family of rockets. Looking to bring that number up to 110 in 46 minutes and 26 seconds. This, of course, is a combination of both Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets, of which there were 2 that launched earlier this year. One with the final of the GOES-R series of satellites for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The second, of course, the Europa Clipper mission, flying a fully expendable version of a Falcon Heavy rocket, sending the Europa Clipper spacecraft off to its namesake moon of Jupiter. Where this Falcon 9 rocket is going to be flying and where its first stage booster is going to be perched following stage separation. Taking a look at the satellite view from Slick 40 or Space Launch Complex 40 here on Florida's Space Coast. This is a mission to the sixth shell, the Starlink constellation, which means it's going to be following that green path you see here on your screen. Stage separation, the first stage booster is going to be landing on the SpaceX drone ship called a shortfall of gravitas. If successful, this will mark the 84th booster landing on a drone ship to date and the 366th booster landing in SpaceX history. SpaceX will also endeavor to recover the payload fairings as well as the first stage booster. They splashed down in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean under the support of parachutes. Fairing halves that we saw fly earlier today supporting KoreaSat 6A flew for a fourth time each. No word on how many flights these two fairing halves have completed. SpaceX is working to certify both its first stage boosters as well as fairing halves for up to 40 flights each. SpaceX will use a recovery vessel to scoop up the fairing halves, bring them back to port. Earlier today, they used the recovery vessel called Doug. On tap this evening will be Bob. These two recovery vessels, Bob and Doug, of course, named after the astronauts who flew aboard the Demo 2 mission, now former NASA astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, restoring human spaceflight to U.S. soil back with that mission, which launched in May of 2020. Both of you. And thanks to Daniel H. for gifting 2 Spaceflight Now memberships and to moderator and channel member Mark Otto for gifting 10. So to our now newest 14 channel members, welcome aboard to all of you. Glad to have you with us. To those who were gifted memberships, be sure to thank Daniel and Mark in the live chat if you haven't already. We hope you decide to stick around with channel membership. Also, now is as good a time as any to remind you to subscribe to Spaceflight Now if you haven't already done so. It's a quick, easy, and free way to support the channel here. Getting close to 300,000, sitting at about 289,000 at the moment. And of course, we are ramping up for the next launch of SpaceX's Starship rocket. Our crew will be heading back down to Starbase facilities ahead of that mission and getting ready to bring you more robust live coverage from down in the Boca Chica Beach area. You'll want to be subscribed and have your notifications turned on for when new content drops in the run-up to, and of course, the actual live launch stream itself. And thanks to Callistia Lee for gifting 10 Spaceflight Now memberships. Thank you, Callistia. Appreciate that generosity. Now, T-minus 36 minutes and counting, about a minute away from the start of fueling. On board this Falcon 9 rocket are 24 of the Starlink V2 mini variety of satellite. This is SpaceX's 74th dedicated launch of these satellites so far this year. Each of them clocking at about 1,760 pounds, or about 800 kilograms. Their solar panels and frill, they have a wingspan of about 100 feet, or 30 meters. They use argon hull thrusters for in-orbit maneuvering, as opposed to the previously used Krypton hull thrusters. They were built in Redmond, Washington, which is near Seattle. And after spacecraft separation, they'll be deployed at 180 miles, or 291 kilometers in altitude, at a 43-degree inclination. B-1080 in the SpaceX fleet, going for launch number 12 today. Began its flight log with an astronaut mission to the International Space Station, a private one at that. Axiom Mission 2, or AX2, flying that same Dragon that's currently docked to the space station at the space-facing port, Crew Dragon Freedom. This particular mission, AX2, launched back on May 21st, 2023. It was former NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson's first time as the commander of a private astronaut mission, currently training to lead the AX-4 crew up to the space station early next year. Next up was launch for the European Space Agency. This was the Euclid Observatory, a wide-angle space telescope. That was followed up by a couple of Starlink launches. First up was 6-11 on August 27th, and then 6-24 on October 22nd, 2023. Coming into this year, another Dragonflight, another mission for Axiom Space based in Houston, Texas. AX-3, seeing the return of former NASA astronaut Michael Lopez Alegria to the commander's seat, becoming the first person to fly aboard a SpaceX Dragon capsule twice. Now the first of two, of course, with Jared Isaacman having commanded both Inspiration 4 as well as the Polaris Dawn missions. That was followed up on March 21st by a mission to the International Space Station CRS-30, making some history for SpaceX as the first Dragon 2 spacecraft to launch on an orbital flight path from Space Launch Complex 40, headed up to the space station. A couple more Starlinks to add to this booster's resume. Starlink 6-52 on April 18th, 6-62 on May 23rd. That was followed up by the Astra 1P/SES-24 satellite mission. Another flight to the space station, this time launching Northrop Grumman's Cygnus spacecraft on the NG-21 mission, the second out of 3 planned missions that SpaceX has set to launch on behalf of Northrop Grumman while it works on its next generation Antares rocket in partnership with Firefly. And most recently, Starlink 10-10, launching on October 15th. Brings us to the mission we have on tap today, Starlink 6-69, getting ready to lift off from... We'll invert from before, start from the bottom, and work our way up to the top. First 2/3 of the rocket at the base are the Falcon 9's first stage. Today's booster, B-1080, has flown 11 times before, going for an even dozen with this mission. At the base of the rocket are 9 Merlin engines, which burn a rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Around the engine compartment are black carbon fiber landing legs, which will be used to land the first stage on the drone ship, a short-fall Gravitas. Above the first stage is the inner stage. This is a composite structure consisting of an aluminum honeycomb core, which is surrounded by carbon fiber. In the image on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and steering for the Falcon 9 as it comes back into the atmosphere tail first, like a big old dart heading towards the drone ship. At the top of the inner stage are 3 mechanical latches that attach to the vehicle's second stage, and at first stage main engine cutoff, high-pressure helium is used to release those latches, and 4 pneumatic pushers ensure a clean separation. The second stage engine nozzle is also housed safely inside the inner stage adapter until stage separation. Speaking of that second stage, the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, powered by a single modified Merlin engine called a Merlin vacuum engine, or an MVAC engine. It's equipped with a large nozzle which is optimized for burns in the vacuum of space, hence the name. It produces more than 220,500 pounds of thrust and will be fired twice on today's flight, placing the 24 Starlink satellites into their intended orbit. The MVAC engine burns the same prop mix, RP1 and LOX, same as the first stage. Following Starlink satellite deployment, it will ignite for a third time as deorbit burn, helping to drive the upper stage back into the atmosphere, where it will burn up, helping to eliminate the risk of creating any unnecessary space debris on this mission. Finally, at the top of the rocket are the payload fairings that are encapsulating the 24 Starlink satellites. The fairings are made up of a carbon composite material and stand 13.1 meters or 43 feet tall, or 5.2 meters or 17.1 feet in diameter. 2 halves of the payload fairing will be recovered a little further downrange from where the first stage lands in the drone ship. They gently splash down under parachutes. And the recovery vessel Bob is on standby, getting ready to recover those fairing halves, bring them back into Port Canaveral. Same as the first stage booster. They'll be turned around for a future mission. Again, SpaceX is working to certify both the boosters and the fairing halves for up to 40 flights. Of course, the future missions that they fly are dependent on what they've flown before and what is needed of them in the future. We're now T-minus 8 minutes, 49 seconds and counting, less than 2 minutes away from the start of the engine chill down sequence. The process involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps, helping to protect the engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. Now T-minus 7 minutes, 45 seconds and counting. Seeing a number of folks asking about where this Falcon 9 is going to be launching once it does leave the pad. Now that we've got a few more folks than when we first began, about 22,000 of you, let's go ahead and revisit the trajectory one more time as we get ready to see this Falcon 9 rocket launch in a little more than 7 minutes. Taking a look at a Google Earth view of Pad 40, Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Once the Falcon 9 does leave the pad, it will fly in a southeasterly trajectory to the east of the Caribbean, and following stage separation, first stage booster will land on the SpaceX drone ship called a Shortfall of Gravitas. This mission is set to be the 84th landing of a booster on this particular drone ship, if all goes according to SpaceX's plan. Following stage separation, the payload fairings will also be deployed and splash down in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a little bit further downrange from where the booster lands on the drone ship. SpaceX's recovery vessel Bob will be on deck to scoop them up out of the water and bring them on back into port. Now T-minus 6 bring you in, give you a pad view of the Falcon 9 rocket over there at Space Launch Complex 40.
Strong back recheck has started.
Good call from SpaceX. With the call that you just heard, we'll see the opening of the clamp arms at the pad, and then the transporter erector for the strong back will recline about 1.5 degrees away from the Falcon 9 rocket. Stays in that position until liftoff, at which point it pulls back in a much more rapid fashion to clear the way for the vertical climb of the Falcon 9. You can see those clamp arms opening up right there. These fairing halves look like they've got a little bit more life on them than the fairing halves that we saw earlier today, which had flown for 4 times each. I want to thank Bridget Schultz joining us with the channel membership at the Pad Leader level. Welcome aboard. We're glad to have you with us. One little bit of housekeeping here. As you can see, our countdown clock slightly different than what you see in the SpaceX big box.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
Good call from SpaceX, and there was a reason I was pausing because I didn't want to talk over the call out from them. Anyway, back to what I was just saying about the countdown timelines. Our clock in the upper right-hand corner of the screen is in real time. We're seeing from the SpaceX clock is coming in on a slight delay. So, as was the case with the KoreaSat 6A mission, we'll be making our call outs based off of our countdown timeline in real time to correlate with our tracking cameras here on the ground until we're relying on the SpaceX onboard cameras exclusively, that is.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
With that call from SpaceX, Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. You're seeing the ground gas closeouts right now. They're purging the remaining LOX from the feed lines.
Gas launch closeouts.
And that's that call you just heard. With just about a minute left to go before liftoff, we'll go ahead and take a pause from the live chat for now. Come back to it on the other side of liftoff.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Good call there. We're just waiting. In about 10 seconds, we should hear the SpaceX launch director give their go-ahead for a liftoff.
Starlink 6-69, go for launch.
And with that go-ahead, we are getting ready now. 30 seconds remaining before the planned liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket. "20 seconds. 15 seconds. And here we go. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket on Starlink 6-69. The Falcon 9 has cleared the tower. And far fewer clouds this afternoon. A great liftoff of the Falcon 9. Some great tracking views from our team. Falcon 9 now traveling faster than the speed of sound. Approaching max Q, or the point of greatest aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle.
Max Q.
Hear that good call out. Here's what we're looking for over the next minute or so. We'll see first stage main engine cutoff, or MECO, at about T plus 2 minutes and 26 seconds. That'll be followed a few seconds later by stage separation. The Merlin vacuum engine will start at 2:36, and then the payload fairings will be deployed just before the 3-minute mark.
And vac chill has started.
That call you just heard, they're thermally conditioning the Merlin vacuum engine prior to its ignition. We're now just about 10 seconds away from MECO. MECO? Stage separation. And SES-1.
Stage separation confirmed. MVAC ignition.
Good calls from SpaceX. You're seeing those events on the onboard cameras coming up on payload fairing deployment. There you see the fairings separate. Starlink satellites now exposed to the vacuum of space for the first time on this
Fairing
mission.
separation confirmed.
There's that view from the onboard cameras. Some great views from our tracking cameras this afternoon. Now coming up on the 4th minute into flight. We're a little more than 2 minutes away from the start of the first stage entry burn beginning. Depending on if there's a little bit of cloud cover in between here and there, we may be able to continue tracking this booster, which is what you see here on the center of your screen of the big box, all the way through the start of the entry burn. Sometimes it does get a little low on the horizon in the clouds, but we've got a pretty clear line of sight on it at the moment. And it's a little hard to see just because of the deepness of the blue here, the big box, but every now and again you could just barely make out little hints of the cold gas thrusters. Those little tiny, those are what SpaceX used to adjust the attitude or the positioning of the booster as it continues to make its way towards the drone ship. First stage booster tail number 1080 has passed its apogee, now just about 104 kilometers above surface. Now about 20 seconds away from the start of the entry burn. Entry burn should be underway now in real time, and there it is.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
Stage 1
From
entry
hundreds of
complete.
miles away, there's the entry burn of the Falcon 9's first stage. Well done, Pete. Now dipped into some clouds there from our ground tracking cameras, but we've got the onboard camera views now from the Falcon 9 rocket itself. Some excellent tracking work against
Stage 1
some
entry burn shutdown.
good lighting conditions today. With the conclusion of that entry burn, we are now looking for the start of the landing burn coming up in less than a minute. I call it the FTS, or flight termination system, has been safed, no longer needed at this stage of flight. As you might have guessed from seeing the landing or the entry burn, the landing burn is just far too far away from our camera's positions on the ground to be able to capture too close to the horizon as well. So we'll stick with these onboard camera views from Falcon 9 rocket itself.
Stage 1 transonic.
Falcon 9 now traveling below the speed of sound as it continues to make its way back towards the drone ship, a short fall of gravitas.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 2 is in terminal guidance.
The call for that landing burn, you see it there on your screen. Should be getting some views from the drone ship itself as well.
Landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And a good landing.
MVAC shutdown. Nominal orbit insertion.
And some good call-outs from SpaceX there as they currently stand with the good liftoff and landing of the first stage booster. B-1080 now marking its 12th flight to space and back. This was the 393rd Falcon 9 launch to date, the 108th Falcon 9 launch of 2024. This was SpaceX's 338th Falcon booster reflight, or the launch of a booster that has flown at least once. This was SpaceX's 110th orbital launch of the year so far, including 2 Falcon Heavy rockets. This was their 124th orbital launch within the last 365 days. The 215th orbital launch from Pad 40 for SpaceX, and the 270th overall orbital launch from this particular pad. Here's where the bar chart currently stands, a reflection of those numbers we just read to you. Moving on to some recovery stats. This was the 84th landing of a booster on the drone ship, a short fall of gravitas. That marks the 287th SpaceX drone ship landing and the 366th overall booster landing to date. Finally, with some industry stats, this was the 78th orbital launch from Florida this year, the 117th from U.S. soil, the 128th orbital launch from U.S. rocket company, and the 210th orbital launch attempt from around the world. There have been 6 launch mishaps on the year, so here's where our pie chart currently stands. And with that, I want to go ahead and begin to wind things down. Been a busy double launch day for our team here at Spaceflight Now, so going to go ahead and wrap things up so folks can break down and begin to wind down for the conclusion of this federal holiday, although it really hasn't been much of a day off for our hardworking team. But if we have to be at work, there's no place we'd rather be than with you on a double launch day. So I want to thank our wonderful channel member community for supporting us with this second mission. If you were here for both of them, y'all are troopers, and we appreciate you coming back around the bend. Our thanks to our moderators, Clisty Lee, Aussie Space Girl, Mark Otto, for helping us out with this second live stream. Our thanks, of course, to our photographer, Adam Bernstein, shooting and tracking the rocket. Big thanks to our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images and Pete Carsons with Max Key Productions for supporting us with tracking assistance as well. Thanks to our Spaceflight Now editor, Stephen Young, for running the technical operations of the broadcast. And most of all, thanks to you for watching wherever you happen to be checking in from around the world. looking at another Starlink. Potentially Thursday is probably the earliest that we're gauging this to be, just based off of the departure of this Falcon 9 rocket. It's going to be launching from this pad right here, Space Launch Complex 40. So if you haven't had your fill of launches, got that to look forward to in just a few days here. And then, of course, a week from today, Starship Flight 6 down at Boca Chica Beach in southern Texas. We'll be back and looking forward to the extent to which SpaceX is able to achieve with this mission, hoping to accomplish a Raptor relight as it begins its suborbital trek, mostly around the world, ahead of a splashdown in the Indian Ocean. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I'm Will Robinson Smith. Be good to yourselves, be good to others. With one last look at the American flag, want to wish all of our veterans here and abroad a very happy Veterans Day. And folks, we will see you next time. And until then, bye-bye.